Hi, and welcome back. A video popped into my feed a couple of weeks back called "We've Been Doing Parallel Compression Wrong." I didn't entirely agree with everything in the video, but rather than pick it apart, I'm just going to set out what I think the issues are and how to work around them, for the developers as well as the users. First of all, let's talk about the traditional method, with the compressor fed from an aux send. Here's a transfer graph in Plugin Doctor. This is what no compression looks like. Just a straight diagonal line from bottom left to top right, indicating that the output level is exactly the same as the input level. Now here's a standard downwards compression transfer without makeup gain. No change below the threshold, but above the threshold the output gain increases more slowly than the input gain. Parallel compression means adding those two graphs together like this. Below the compressor threshold, the overall level is boosted by 6 dB as we're adding two copies of the same signal. But as the signal rises above the threshold, the compressed half of the signal starts to become relatively quieter than the uncompressed half, and that level boost starts to taper away. Note, however, that the level boost never quite reaches zero, even at the highest input levels where we're smashing the signal really hard with the compressor. Adding the compressed signal makes the loudest peaks a tiny bit louder, and the quieter parts a lot louder, resulting in a pseudo-upwards compression effect. The point is, however, it's all boost. When you push up that parallel compression fader, how are you supposed to know if it sounds better because of the compression, or because it just got louder? And when you mute that parallel channel, is it worse because it's worse, or just because it's quieter? If you're using a console or a control surface, perhaps you'll be able to feather down the fader for the dry signal as you bring up the compression channel, but it's kind of impossible to do this accurately and repeatably. It becomes impractical if you're sending multiple channels to the parallel compressor, and it doesn't help you if you're mixing with a mouse and keyboard. I do have a strategy to deal with this issue, but I'm going to park the question for now and come back to it later, after a little discussion about wet-dry knobs. If you're processing a single channel or bus, these seem to solve that problem. Using a crossfade means that as you add more compressed signal, the dry signal drops in level, thus maintaining a constant combined output loudness and allowing you to judge the change properly. Well, it does if the dry-wet mix knob has been implemented correctly, which unfortunately this one hasn't. How can you get that wrong, you may ask? By putting it before the makeup gain instead of after. That's how. If I set the knob fully dry, the makeup gain still affects it. Why? Honestly, this is infuriating. Let me explain why it's a problem. If the compressor is applying any gain reduction at all, that will make the dry side of the mix knob louder than the wet side. This results in two different issues. First of all, any change to the mix knob setting results in an overall loudness change, which then has to be compensated for with the gain knob. This is annoying and frustrating, doubly so because it's so unnecessary, and makes it much harder than it needs to be to judge your mix setting. And second, it means that setting the mix knob to 12 o'clock doesn't give you an equal mix of dry and wet. The dry signal is hotter to start with, so will dominate the sound on this setting. An actual equal mix of dry and wet is going to be somewhere up here. No idea where exactly. And the more gain reduction the compressor is applying, the more all the useful settings will be bunched up at the top end of the knob. Now let's talk about how to do it properly. And I'll allow Softube to partially redeem themselves by using another of their compressors. This is the TubeTech CL1B, and I like it a lot. It's full of a unique character. Now notice that if I turn the mix knob fully dry, that output volume knob no longer has any effect. This is perfect. If we're using this knob properly, it will be set to compensate the loudness change from the compression, so that when I bypass the compression, the loudness doesn't really change, and I can properly judge the difference. So by setting the makeup gain correctly, I've also, in effect, calibrated the mix knob. Now the dry and wet signals are roughly equal in loudness to start with, so a 12 o'clock setting actually does result in equal amounts of both. When it's now equally easy to explore more extreme settings where the compressed signal dominates, or more gentle settings where the dry signal dominates. and you never need to stop to compensate the loudness. So the question is, if Softube can get it right in the TubeTech compressor, how on earth did they manage to get it wrong in the VCA compressor? Now I can hear some of you shouting at your screens that doing it this way around allows you to adjust to the output level without changing the dry-wet mix you've dialed in. I don't think this is a valid argument, for two reasons. First of all, the makeup gain is not a creative control that you should be using to set the balance of your mix. That's what your faders are for. The makeup gain is there purely to compensate for the loudness change caused by the compression, and therefore has a correct setting. Or at least a correct range of settings, as loudness is ultimately subjective. If you set the makeup gain correctly when the mix knob is fully wet, and the mix knob is configured correctly, you won't have to adjust it when you change the dry-wet mix. And anyway, all the Softube compressors have extra sidebar panels, including one on the right with output gain and automatic level matching. This one in the TubeTech allows you to adjust the output gain without changing the dry-wet mix, should you need to do that. But this one in the VCA compressor is just a duplicate of the gain control on the panel. Note that I've picked on Softube because they have good examples of both implementations, but I could have chosen many other compressors from other developers. It seems like 50-50 at the moment whether each new compressor I try will get this right or not. And I should probably add that I do like these Softube compressors a lot in every other way. So my message to developers: if you're putting a dry-wet mix knob on a compressor, or a distortion plugin for that matter, please make sure the dry part of the signal is the unmodified dry signal, and the gain control only affects the wet side. Alright then, how do we correctly do compression on a send? Here's the trick, and it's actually very simple. I'll solo the compression channel to start with, then bypass the compressor, and if necessary, adjust the makeup gain so that the dry and wet signals are reasonably well loudness matched, just as I would for any normal compressor. I'll make a mental note of how much I changed the gain so that I can compensate with the fader level, and if I take it out of solo, I'm back where I started. Except now, instead of muting the compression channel to assess the difference, I'm instead going to bypass the compressor on the parallel channel. Now I'm still hearing the loudness boost from the parallel channel, but it's only a loudness boost, it's not changing the dynamics at all. And I can now toggle bypass and properly assess the difference. That's all, hope that helps, and thanks for watching.